Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jen Leach, and I'm the Vice President of Operations and Engagement for RBC's Sustainability and Impact team. Before we get into the content of the session today, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm situated on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat. I'd also like to acknowledge that many of us are joining today from places near and far that are situated on various overlapping, unceded, and traditional territories across this land, now home to over 630 First Nations and many more Métis and Inuit peoples. I'd like to acknowledge and express my gratitude to the traditional owners and caretakers of all of these lands. Okay, let's get started. I'm thrilled that you've joined us today for RBC's sponsored webinar focused on building cyber resilience for your nonprofit. At RBC, we recognize that nonprofits are facing unprecedented pressures and challenges. And as one of Canada's largest corporate funders, we see it as our responsibility to invest in the overall health and sustainability of our community investment partners and the not-for-profit sector as a whole. And that's why we've committed to help the sector to build its capacity through the RBC Stronger Nonprofits program, where we're funding programs that support leadership and talent resilience, as well as digital skills and development. And I think we all recognize that cybersecurity is a critical challenge facing all sectors, but it's one that's often overlooked by charities and nonprofits. So I'm absolutely thrilled today that we've been able to bring together such an incredible panel to share their expertise. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce Charlene Gandhi from the Future of Good, who will be moderating the panel discussion today. Charlene, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jen, for that introduction, and to everybody that's joined us online. Hello, bonjour, and Ani. Welcome to Future of Good and RBC's webinar on building cyber resilience in your nonprofit. Now, if we haven't met yet, my name is Charlene Gandhi. I am one of the reporters here at Future of Good, and one of my reporting specialisms is technology, data, and AI in the social purpose space. So, as Jen said, we've gathered to talk about a pretty urgent issue: cybersecurity risks, emerging threats, and really how the nonprofit and charitable sectors can protect themselves against these threats. It seems like we're in an age where we can't go a few days without hearing about another cybersecurity or data breach, from sensitive data that has been exposed to entire organizations whose systems have been hacked through a simple phishing email. Now, in the age of AI, there's a whole new suite of threats to be cognizant of, from model poisoning to AI-powered bots. Now, those of us who live and work in the GTA might remember the infamous cybersecurity incident from last year that brought the whole Toronto Public Library to its knees for months on end and put the personal data of its staff at risk. Now, on the flip side, research has consistently indicated that cybersecurity and data privacy are not always top priorities for the nonprofit and charitable sector, be that by choice or because of a lack of capacity. Now, it may be that organizations don't have the technical know-how in-house to start investing in their cybersecurity readiness. And it also may be that they just don't think that they are worthy targets for hackers. Now, one thing that you're definitely going to take away from today's webinar is that nonprofits, charities, and social purpose organizations are just as much at risk of a cybersecurity or data breach as their counterparts in the government or in the private sector. We have sensitive donor and payment data, we have staff data, and we have bank accounts. And that's really all it takes. And in fact, the nonprofit and charitable sectors have an additional responsibility to steward the data of vulnerable and marginalized communities, for whom the effects of a potential cybersecurity or data breach might be much more costly than for others. So we're really, really grateful to RBC for co-hosting this very timely expert insight session today, and for producing resources for the nonprofit sector. We're grateful for the ongoing work of the Canadian Centre for Nonprofit Digital Resilience and the Cyber Nations Foundation, both of whom are joining us today, as well as the teams at Technology Helps, the Rogers Cybersecurity Catalyst, and Open North for their ongoing work in supporting the sector's cybersecurity resilience. So today I have with me Milos Stojadinovic from RBC. I have Claudette McGowan from the Cyber Nations Foundation and Wilfreda Edward from the Canadian Centre for Nonprofit Digital Resilience. So we're going to spend approximately 40 minutes speaking about the current state of cybersecurity readiness in our sector, emerging threats that have appeared in light of artificial intelligence, and really take you through some really practical solutions that organizations of any size can implement today. And we also know that a number of you have submitted questions ahead of time, so thank you very much for doing that. And we'll get to a few of those before we close for the day as well. Our speakers are really embedded into this space, working with small organizations, nonprofits, and charities. And so they can speak to some of the high-level trends that they've been observing, as well as some specific case studies that they have seen in their time. And thankfully, I'm not going to have to answer any of these hard questions. It's over to Claudette, Milos, and Wilfreda. Welcome to the three of you, and we're so happy to have you all here today with us. I'm going to start by asking you to very, very quickly introduce yourselves and answer that first question of why nonprofits, charities, foundations, and social purpose organizations are really just as much at risk of a cybersecurity breach as any other type of organization in the private and public sectors as well. Wilfreda, I'm going to pick on you to start first.
I'm happy to, Charlene. Thank you to RBC and to Future of Good for creating this space for this conversation today. It's really an honor to be here. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Nonprofit Digital Resilience, commonly known as CINDR. And at CINDR, we really believe that every organization in the sector, no matter how big, no matter their budget, no matter their composition, or the community they serve, they should have access to data and technology in service of their missions. And so we focus a lot on empowering the sector to be able to do that. And part of that empowerment comes from understanding that the value that the sector brings, which really speaks to that first question that you spoke about, Charlene. We think about the economic contribution that our sector makes. We talk about the 8% of GDP that we contribute to, the over 2.5 million people that the sector employs, and how that contribution is greater than oil and gas, manufacturing, the auto industry. And so when we think about that value, it puts the element of risk kind of into perspective. Mm-hmm. And so in making that contribution, our work, you spoke about the vulnerable people that organizations are serving in this sector. At the local and community level, our organizations are entrusted with this deeply personal information that's highly sensitive as we work to help trans youth, asylum seekers, victims of gender-based violence, and so on. And so we steward this data on medical and mental health records, income and debt records, family separation details, immigration status, school records, all of this deeply sensitive data. So a single breach is not just about donor emails and amounts. It's about the financial implications. An organization that has a $250,000 a year budget, if they get a single breach, that wipes out their organization. It means they can no longer operate. They can no longer serve communities. Plus, their reputation and the trust that they work to build through their work is violated. And it takes decades to build that trust. And then we look at the data itself. It exposes that data, directly endangering the lives of individuals and compromising immigration status, for example. So there's a lot at stake here. And so this conversation is really shining a light on those risks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Wilfreda. I'm really glad that you brought up the sort of trust as a currency in the nonprofit and charitable sectors, and of course for organizations writ large, but there is an added layer of responsibility that this sector carries with it. Milos, I'll come to you next.
Thank you so much. And folks, it's an honor to be speaking with the fellow panelists here and to the audience that's taken their time to join us today. I think we've got about 140 or so people on the call, which is wonderful to see. My name is Milos. I am the Global Head of Advanced Threat Operations for RBC. So I lead our adversary emulation, which is our offensive capabilities, our threat hunting capabilities, our applied security research, and a couple of other teams in that space, including threat modeling. So I very much so live on the forefront of what's happening in security from an offensive and a defensive perspective. I see what's happening nationally in our organization as well. And outside of that, I'm a distinguished engineer at RBC, so I spend quite a bit of time doing engagement with academics, students, speaking wherever I can possibly. This is obviously one of those things that I have the privilege of being part of. And most importantly, I think I'm very passionate about cybersecurity. Something I chose as a passion and not an industry I ended up being in. So I think it's more important than ever to think about how we protect nonprofit organizations and small and medium businesses in Canada in general.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Milos. And Claudette, over to you.
Hi there, Claudette McGowan. Just thrilled to be here today. Thank you, Future of Good and RBC. And the problem that we're trying to solve at Cyber Nations Foundation is we've got 5 billion people using the internet right now. 330 million businesses using the internet right now, and believe it or not, more than 50% already compromised. So how do we elevate the level of digital literacy worldwide? I want everyone to think about when they first got a phone or bought a tablet. There was a little pamphlet inside. It told you, here's the power button, here's the volume, and nothing about how you're going to operate on the digital roadway. And so we're all about advocating for cyber literacy as a human right. If there's 5 billion of us using these things, then we have to know how to protect ourselves. It's good to be connected, but even better to be protected. And we think about the nonprofit world. There's so many great points that Milos and Wilfredo brought up, so I won't repeat them. But what I want to leave you with is one thing. These cyber threat criminals, they don't just want to breach you, they want to be you. And identity is the new frontier. And so with this data that is so attractive, whether you're a big corporation, a small nonprofit, the data is that currency. That is what they want. And if they can get a hold of that, that means reputational risk and damage. In addition to that, what are all the things that you connect to? And so you have the donors, absolutely, but you have everything in that ecosystem. And most of the time, the people in that ecosystem do other things as well, too. So if I can reach you and I can be you, because some of us like to reuse passwords, not calling anybody out, but if you're doing things that make you more attractive, then it's fair game. And the last thing I would say is in the nonprofit sector specifically, I don't know how many organizations would put their hand up to say we have too much money. It's an abundance of riches. We don't have to worry about these things. So it is known that we are struggling and have different challenges financially. It is known that we are funded through the good hearts and means of different organizations. And so knowing that there probably isn't a chief information security officer, there probably isn't an incident responder, there probably isn't vulnerability scanning and assessments being done. This is what makes this sector so attractive.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Claudette. You've actually positioned us almost perfectly to transition into talking about why the nonprofit and charitable sectors might be falling behind. And I really liked your framing of cybersecurity as a human right. And still, we seem to be seeing this pretty growing divide between organizations that are and are not able to afford or able to access security infrastructure. And so, Claudette, I'm going to pick on you again on this. Why are our sectors falling behind? You started to answer it already, but really, what are you seeing on the ground that is leading to that divide and that gap in access to security?
Yeah, the two things I would highlight is obviously everyone's trying to stretch the same dollar. And, we are mission-driven, purpose-oriented organizations. And so we're going to put the funding into where do you make the biggest impact? And so some of the trade-offs are how much do I have to invest in security versus doing the thing that I'm mandated to do? Mm-hmm. I think that's the big thing. So that prioritization of the dollar is a struggle. And I think the second thing that really comes to mind is, and you touched on it, Charlene, at the beginning, who's going to attack the zoo, right? Who's going to attack this small mom and pop, family organization, this small, association? There's only 7 people that work there. I tell anybody, if you have $4.97 in the bank, there's somebody around the world who wants that $4.97. So recognize that anybody of any size can be a target, and you're never too small. And as we know from other organizations, you're never too big. It's fair game.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Freda, Cinder has done some research on this front in where nonprofits are with their cybersecurity infrastructure today. Talk us through some of the things that you've been seeing when it comes to this divide, or on the other hand, if you've seen that some nonprofits are really stepping forward with their cybersecurity readiness.
Yeah, thanks, Charlene. I think Claudette's point is exactly correct. Prioritization of the dollar. Where does that come from is kind of where our work is trying to identify. We look at this from a systems level approach. So although the problem may seem to be rooted in technology, it's actually a funding problem that has equity consequences. So it's rooted in decades of digital infrastructure being treated as overhead, and funders traditionally don't fund overhead. So it's a challenge to say to an organization, your mission matters, we care about what you do, while chronically underfunding the critical infrastructure that allows them to carry that mission out. So when funders get to decide what's essential and what's overhead, what they're really doing is deciding who can participate in the work and who can't.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Milos, you obviously work with organizations in various sectors. What are you observing in terms of some of the reasons that some groups may be more likely to be able to access cybersecurity infrastructure than others?
So I would echo much of the similar sentiment that Claudette and Wilfreda have mentioned. I mean, they're absolutely true, right? Organizations still have largely the same funding that they've always had. And maybe a number of years ago, security was more optional. But as we continue to digitize the services that we provide to people, or the mechanisms by which we can make those services accessible, whether those are nonprofit, for-profit organizations, the attack surface or the digital sprawl grows. And as that grows, so does the cost and the complexity of securing this kind of infrastructure and ecosystem and applications and people. And then we have another paradigm that emerges that compounds that problem, which is the barrier to entry for cyber attack is continuously getting lower, which makes it easier for would-be criminals to become real criminals in the cyber world. There is a maturation that's happening in the cybercrime economy in terms of providing effectively crime as a service for malicious individuals with seed funding. So it's the combination of complexity as well as the lowering of barrier to entry into the cybercrime world that I think is creating quite a dangerous climate for organizations that, and all organizations have limited funds, but certainly small, medium organizations and nonprofits are trying to allocate those funds as much as they can that are core to what their business model is, or the value that they're trying to provide to the community. So I think Wilfreda hit the nail on the head there with regards to technology, and security has always looked at this overhead, but where we are today with how we provide services, it's a non-optional overhead to be able to do that in a way that's safe and sound for the people that you're trying to help.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I suppose on that note, funding is, and in many, many different areas of how we talk about nonprofits and charities, is always going to be a barrier. When it comes to cybersecurity, to what extent have you all seen that organizations are thinking about policies, for example, and practices in their organizations that they can embed, whether or not they have that technical person on staff?
I'm happy to chime in
Yeah.
and to say, when it comes to policies, policies are your friend. And when people are thinking about cybersecurity and investment, it has to be the latest software, or it has to be a piece of hardware. When really, in many cases, it could be about configuration settings, policies, processes, things that you're doing, like tabletop exercising, practicing what would you do should the bad day occur. So I think one is just, we need to, again, back to that digital literacy, elevate the knowledge on setting something like a banner. So if something comes from the outside, you get a banner that tells you this email is not internal, and things like business email compromise get kind of caught in that loop. It's really, really important to look at things like what's your password policy, multi-factor authentication, all these things that, they require maybe a click or two of a button, or writing something and saying, let's test for understanding. So I think policy is probably not discussed as often, and I think it's probably one of the fastest paths and least expensive path to being more secure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we often talk about policy from the perspective of behavior control, and it sounds like this heavy, dirty word and that's about making people change their behaviors. But I think policy is really an opportunity to provide clarity so that people have space for creativity and safety. And so if you give them the guardrails and the structure in the sandbox, there's the do's and the don'ts for kids so that they're not going crazy and the crazy way that kids play in sandboxes sometimes. Every environment needs those guardrails for safety and to create space for people to be able to do the things that they need to do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There's a fascinating example from Alberta and an organization called Islamic Family that have put together a really phenomenal cybersecurity policy that feels, for lack of a better word, very non-threatening. It feels very accessible for everybody in the organization, from frontline staff all the way to people that are more on the technical end of the skills spectrum. And the way that they went about putting it together was very warm, actually, which isn't a word that you often associate with something like cybersecurity. You know, it was a whole organization initiative to go, okay, this is a collective responsibility. How do we do it well in a way that doesn't disenfranchise anyone? But I think when we look at the age of AI and this whole sort of brand new bubble of technologies and the associated threats that have emerged, I think organizations are back in the dark to some degree. And so, Milos, I really want to start with you here in asking about where are we, you know, when it comes to some of these additional risks that the sector needs to be aware of in the age of AI, beyond phishing and, you know, beyond some of those data breaches that folks are familiar with. What do we need to be aware of at this particular time?
Yeah, I think I generally try to classify this into two categories. You have the world of what AI has enhanced, and then you have sort of AI native threat that is kind of new or novel to the world. That's as a result of AI technologies, or really more accurately, generative AI technologies that we've seen come about over the last 3 or 4 years. And I think the majority of the risk for many organizations actually sits in the AI enhanced realm, because the net effect that a lot of AI is really creating is a speed and scaling advantage to adversaries. And so the net effect for organization is a compression of timelines for breaches to occur. Things that might have taken weeks before can potentially move much quicker now. And I think to some degree, there's a healthy dollop of hype that we're all hearing about in terms of what's possible versus what's not possible. But the barrier to entry, again, is going down slowly, or rather rapidly. And so what we want to do is be aware of where is AI technology accelerating. So phishing, you mentioned, actually is a pretty significant component, and it's not the phishing of yesteryear, right? There's no typos. Things look very real. They're personalized because AIs can do the research to find people's social media profiles, understand what's going on in their organization, hone, and more importantly, the relatively low cost of orchestrating these kinds of attacks at scale means that it's not a campaign, but it's a new sustained pressure that organizations are going to be seeing. And if you take that kind of problem and you apply it across your digital perimeter, what systems you have exposed, what identities you may have exposed, it's very feasible for threat actors to start ratcheting this capability to constantly assess. So Claudette mentioned this notion of no one reuses their passwords, right? And I think it's kind of the insider joke in the security world. Of course people do, right? But previously, what might have happened is that your credential may have gotten breached because you signed up to a website that you completely forgot about, and they got compromised. And now your email and that credential are floating around on the internet. And an attacker may take that information and they may try to see, well, can I use that to log into Gmail? Can I use it to log into this other platform, and see if they can do further really identity-focused theft. But with AI, you can do this stuff very quickly. So it's not a human effort. It's not even a scripted effort. It's really something that you can stitch together and have work as a collective system. So I think for most organizations, the pressures are, yes, there are AI native threats that we need to be worried about, but that's largely tends to be for people who are building some of these technologies for themselves. I think for most organizations, it's the pressure of the compression of attack scale, coming down to what used to be weeks or months to minutes or hours these days.
Claudette, Wilfreda, I'm interested in whether you have seen this play out on the ground in some of the work that you do with nonprofits, and especially knowing that nonprofits are seeking out where AI can support them in their already very inflated workloads. So talk me through where you've seen perhaps an application of AI that hasn't maybe had the most security-minded perspective to begin with, or really what else you're seeing in this age of artificial intelligence.
Yeah, the one that comes to mind for me is just around the excitement on the LLM. Oh my gosh, you can put a presentation together for me. This used to take me hours and now it's taking me like less than a minute. That's amazing. What data are you uploading into that model? Is there anything there that you shouldn't want anyone to see, even before a certain date, because we have things around when you report, what you report. And so that lovely table that was done automatically, now it's in a public LLM. So that's one of the things that we're seeing. And so the cyber literacy we speak about, well, there's an AI literacy as well. Mm-hmm. And there has to be an AI policy. So back to your original point, is that policies play a big role. And so we have seen some things land in, some of these models that are not meant to be there, and they become public record. The other thing I will talk about is really around what you get from the model. So this output, and it looks like it's perfect, and then you put this into the presentation and you find out it's completely wrong. There's been a hallucination of some sort. So this kind of human in the loop or human on the loop, I understanding that, don't have too much, don't be overconfident about what you find. You should still check and challenge. It's just like someone came and told you something, you'd want to validate that data. And then of course, we're seeing obviously the deep fakes happen through voice, through video, so those impersonations, and to nonprofits. So again, not that you have to be a massive organization, it can happen to any industry. And we're seeing that. And typically it's, faking the CEO, trying to get the CFO to wire some funds. And these again are all AI generated threats and attacks.
Yeah. Wilfreda, how about you?
Yeah, everything that Milos and Claudia has pointed out is what we're seeing actively on a day-to-day in the conversations that we have with nonprofits. The other thing that comes up very often is the complexity in the language used to talk about AI. Just this week, we were giving a workshop on data storytelling, and during the question period, someone asked, I'm just so overwhelmed. This is a leader of a grassroots organization that's helping newcomers in the Kitchener and Waterloo area. She's trying to do work with community, and she's told that AI is here. You have to use it, get on board, or you're going to be left behind. Yeah. And then she goes to use it, and there's language, and this is an intelligent person. She's educated. She is not the problem, but she's made to feel that she cannot understand this. It is out of her reach and out of her realm, and she has to struggle to keep up. So how do we support them in these organizations and demystifying the fear, the risk, the uncertainty around AI through accessible language, through upskilling, through research, to kind of bring that fear down and that uncertainty down?
Yeah, and it's interesting, even just anecdotally, knowing that there are people that consider data to just be numerical, and maybe not knowing that things like images and video and text also counts as data that can be compromised. And we did some reporting last year on cyberbullying, in fact, and some of the stories that came out of that were of organizations that had their systems totally overrun by AI-powered bots, their forms and their inboxes in a way that A, they couldn't get into any of their inboxes, but B, it just brought the whole organization to its knees until it was able to be resolved because of the flood of notifications that were coming into their systems in a way that, the speed just was not attainable by a person. It was absolutely artificial intelligence driven, but they were targeted. Their systems were targeted. And so this very much does happen. And Milos, as you alluded to, AI is only going to scale that up. Wilfreda, you actually mentioned a really great point there in terms of the overwhelm that organizations are facing. Because in this sort of AI age, it's made to feel inaccessible, and it's made to feel, again, as though if you don't get on board, you might be left behind. And so there's this rush to get on board. And at the end of the day, we've also got organizations in this sector that maybe don't have that technical individual on staff, or even someone that they can turn to say, how do we do this well? And how do we do this properly? And how do we do this safely? Mm-hmm. So for those organizations in particular who don't have that technical person on staff, what can they do today to put themselves in a better position against this sort of heightened state of risks? And perhaps, Claudette, I'll start with you first on this one.
Yeah, the beautiful thing is there's many, many free resources online that can help you out. So, just going and doing a quick search for things, whether it's from the Canadian Center of Cybersecurity, there's phenomenal websites. If you're, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, there's frameworks there, there's checklists there, and there's videos on YouTube that, like, just type in here, I want to get better at cyber, and something will come up. It'll be 5 minutes, and it is consumable, it is accessible. And so I think be curious. Don't wait for the crisis to become curious. Be curious and say, what can I do to learn more? And then the other piece I would just highlight is the simulations. Do something, have a cyber day, right? We're going to bring somebody in, it could be a speaker, and we're going to do a tabletop exercise, which is basically a simulation of some kind of cyber incident. How do we respond? The first time you do it, you're going to realize, my gosh, we got to get better at this. And then the second time you get a little better, and the third time, you're ready. And so I think that's something I always encourage folks to do, is just to get immersed in it. And even if you don't have the line item, on the budget, somebody in industry. There's a great crew of people right here on this screen that I'm sure, are happy to lend some support. So phone a friend, if you will, because that's very much needed. And don't wait for the bad day to be figuring it out. That's the worst time to learn how to run your operation when it comes to cybersecurity.
And Claudette, if there was one thing that folks could do straight after this webinar, what would it be?
I would say turn on multi-factor authentication organization-wide.
And you're seeing that that's not necessarily the case everywhere, I'm assuming?
We are definitely seeing that's not the case.
Okay.
In many spaces, yeah.
Milos and Wilfreda, same question to you. Today, what could folks do, especially those that don't have that technical person on staff that they can turn to? And that can be, as Claudette said, something very practical, but also a resource that you are aware of that is there for the nonprofit sector to take part
of. I lost the last part of the question, but I think I got the gist of it. I'm going to piggyback off of Claudette's response to phone a friend, because we are that friend. And Cyber Nations is that friend. Our role is really to help connect you to all of the resources and the opportunities available in the sector already, the free ones, the ones that are low or no cost. There really is a tremendous amount of support in this sector around cybersecurity. And we often talk about the sector being left behind, or that we don't have the resources. But there is a lot here, and we are here to help connect you to it.
Milos, how about yourself?
I hate to sound like I'm repeating, but I echo a lot of the same sentiment that's already been shared. I would say one thing also that, absolutely, there's a ton of great first party resources to go to that are available in Canada, that are US, UK, many countries where this data is being published. YouTube is incredibly valuable. I think it's like the world's free university these days, it seems like almost. You can learn so many things, but sometimes the challenge is knowing where to start. And I would say that AI these days, like chatbots, are pretty decent at helping you get an idea of like, where do you start? You can provide some explanation. To Claudette's point, be careful what you share and how that data may be used, but to say, hey, what should I be thinking of? And invariably, I think most of that will come back to, you need to understand what's important for your organization, right? Whether you're a nonprofit or for-profit organization, there are services, products, capabilities that you deliver that are critical and that are the backbone of what you do. And if suddenly you can't deliver those or they're unavailable, they have a significant impact to your organization. If you start there and you say, okay, and I'm going to take a page out of Claudette's book, and I say, okay, well, let's do a tabletop exercise. And we say, okay, some kind of cyber attack happens, and this service becomes unavailable, or we can't deliver this product. What does that mean to our organization? How would we recover? And that thought process will start those wheels turning of setting some of the foundations in an organization about security. And absolutely, I would say many people that are in this industry are not. I don't think this is an industry you just happen to fall into. It's pretty demanding. There's a lot of dynamic change. So most people that are in it love this space, and they really love to share their insights. And I think that there is no shortage, I would say, of professionals that are willing to lend their thoughts and give an opinion and a perspective. So yeah, phone a friend, absolutely.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you guys so much. I'm really enjoying the phone a friend piece of advice that folks can take away from this. And to all of you also, thank you for bridging that divide between what can feel like quite an opaque space, cybersecurity, and really the impact on people and programs. Because I think for the sector, that's really what it falls down to, is if we don't do X, how does it have an impact on Y? Those two things aren't siloed. We've already started to talk a little bit about resources, so I'm just going to come to a question that has arrived in the chat about any grants or free tools that are available to support policy development specifically, and if any of the three of you have seen anything on that front.
The call for proposals is now closed, but the CERA grant comes out annually to support nonprofits around cybersecurity. So that would be the top one that comes to mind. The Imagine Canada also has a Grant Connect tool that can help find additional funding and granting opportunities for nonprofits. So I would check those two.
Amazing. Claudette or Milos, either of you?
I think certainly the work that we're partnering on with RBC to make things available for nonprofits, it's been wonderful just to be able to let people know the pathway to things. So organizations like mine and Wilfreda's and many others. So there are these so ESG parts of the organization that really help to connect the dots for nonprofits. And again, I go back to the stuff that's online, whether you're going to things through Microsoft has some offerings for nonprofits, Google as well too. It's about finding the time, one, to look for it, and then two, to consume it. And so the one thing I would suggest is, picking one person in the organization, and just like we have a fire warden, there should be a cyber warden as well too. And that person maybe could be the one championing it for the organization and helping to make sure that everybody's okay, whether it's proactive or reactive.
Yeah, absolutely. Milos, did you have anything to add on that, on the policy development front?
Yeah, I would say on the funding elements, I'm not sure if we can get Jennifer Leach to get back to the stage. I know she's got plenty of information in that space. Outside of that, from an RBC perspective, outside of that, I would echo Claudette's statements around there are organizations that offer very preferable pricing for nonprofits. And I think that goes pretty much across the board for virtually every cybersecurity vendor that I can think of, that they have radically different and heavily discounted pricing. And I think that some organizations may not be aware of that, especially if you're small and you think, hey, I'm just going to go on the website, I'm going to purchase the license and I'll pay whatever the list price is. But the reality could be that if you spend a little bit of time understanding what the paradigm is, you can actually find quite a bit more ways to leverage that dollar or stretch that dollar that we were talking about at the outset.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Jen, I would love to see if we can bring you back on stage just to answer this question about policy development and resources.
Absolutely. I think really, a lot of funders have we fund programs, but a lot of funders offer overhead portions of their funding to support with infrastructure. So I think it's really around having that conversation with the relationship manager at RBC or other organizations that you deal with. Speak transparently about your needs. Funders want to listen and want to support. So just be honest about what you need and have that dialogue.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Claudette, we've had another question. In fact, this is for everybody. But Claudette, since you brought up that tabletop exercise, we've had a question about what an organization should do if they have never done one. How do you go about organizing and running something of that nature?
Yeah, so again, I would say, I know, Wilfreda, you probably have some resources, and we certainly do as well. And then for those of you, you can go on YouTube and just say tabletop exercise and watch one in progress. I think that's good to see it. Milos had a great point. Sometimes these LLMs are our friends. Put in there, simulated tabletop exercise. Give me the step-by-step process to run a 30-minute tabletop exercise around an agentic AI scenario. Make it very rich and descriptive, and you can get something immediately. And it's always good to have somebody for the first time facilitate it for you. But if you're not able to do that, then it's certainly a do-it-yourself opportunity. And of course, for those who can't afford it, some of the big brands, they'll come and do it. When we were in banking, we would have big organizations come and do it for us. But again, I think it's something that we've seen from a nonprofit perspective. You're able to find partners that'll do it for you, or you can do it yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
If I could add to that, yes, the Rogers, one of those partners is Rogers Cybersecurity Catalyst out of TMU. Last October, for Cyber Awareness Month, we ran a webinar, which Protexa was a part of, just helping to support nonprofits in basic entry-level advice that you could pick up and apply right after the webinar. And so we ran a tabletop exercise as part of that webinar, and we still have a great relationship with Rogers and are constantly in conversation about how we can make this information more readily available for nonprofits.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And one more resource that I wanted to point folks towards, it's in the US, but might be of use, is the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. I believe that they have got a AI policy support tool that folks can access. So it might be worth going to check that one out as well, especially for those in the nonprofit and charitable sectors. Okay, folks, we had quite a few questions come in as we were in the lead up to this particular event. So I do want to take some time to answer those. And the first one is something that we also have covered at Future of Good, as and when it was a little bit more new, shall I say, and that's cybersecurity insurance. The question was, do organizations invest in it? How do they invest in it? What do they need to show to their insurer really to be able to access this type of insurance and be able to access it well and fully and thoroughly?
I'm certainly seeing more organizations invest in it, and sometimes just to get your renewal, there's an option that says you kind of need it, right? Especially if you're handling data. So that's really important, is what's your business? What are your kind of digital crown jewels and how do you protect them? And I've seen insurers actually have people do penetration tests or vulnerability scans and be able to say, hey, we found that you have some weaknesses here. And either you're going to remediate them and get the support, or you don't get the insurance. And so I think it's important. It's just general insurance. There's a view of how are you doing on your cybersecurity? How are you protecting your digital assets?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Freda or Milos, what does cybersecurity insurance look like in your particular context, and how can nonprofits go about finding the right provider for them?
It's a really good question. And our work, our role is really to help nonprofits get access to the answer to these questions. So it's through strategic partnerships like the one we have with RBC, like the ones we have with Cyber Nations. We help connect them to those experts and that expertise, so we don't hold it ourselves. And so the answer that Claudette gave is really the expert answer for this question. And so I would defer to that guidance.
Absolutely. Milos, how about yourself?
In the same boat, I would say that cyber insurance can be quite complicated, and reviewing the terms and conditions of that insurance is a non-trivial task, especially when it comes to one is getting the insurance, the other one is if something happens, having that insurance protect you appropriately. So it's important that the right guidance is used to understand what are your obligation as the entity being insured to ensure that that policy will actually be there to protect you in times of need.
Yeah, absolutely. And just off the back of that, I think a lot of nonprofits and charities will have the question of, well, is cybersecurity insurance financially accessible to me? And just wondered if any of the three of you had seen anything on that front about whether this is something that is accessible to this sector from a financial perspective.
I certainly have seen it being accessible in certain packages, and sometimes it's tied to how big or small the organization is from revenue perspective. But one of the things to highlight when it comes to cyber insurance, and Milos touched on it, those terms. What does it actually mean? If you're in a ransomware situation, do you get a negotiator with that? What unlocks the support that you need? So that one size does not fit all, and you really have to, the devil's in the details. You really have to understand, what is it going to do for me proactively? What is it going to do in the moment and kind of reactively as well? So I think that's something I'd ask everyone not to sign off on anything lightly, to understand what it means, and also to make sure you get references on the places that are offering cyber insurance. Do they pay out? Are they there for you when you need them? Because they don't all provide the same level of service.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Okay, another question came up around cloud-based platforms, and knowing that a lot of our sector, especially the smaller organizations, are probably relying pretty heavily on your Google Drives and your SharePoints of the world. Assuming that folks cannot transition off that way of working, how do they make sure that they are adequately set up to be safe, to be secure, and to make sure that their information is as protected as it can be? Milos, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that cloud, or we'll call it SaaS, or these sort of cloud native solutions bring an interesting advantage where they abstract some of the challenges of managing the infrastructure or the application stack to get things done, right? So before Gmail, if you were a business, maybe you'd have to run a full like Exchange, and somebody's got to manage that and patch that server. And now you can just pay $8, $10, $12 a month and you've got access to that. But that being said, as cloud services become more complicated and we start to interconnect different services with each other and leverage an identity from one provider into another, the complexity is still there, right? So if you're not just leveraging SaaS, for example, like you're using your SharePoints, your Confluence, your Gmail, but maybe you're building something in AWS, or you're building something in Google Cloud or in Azure, that's a pretty complicated space as well. So I would say where it has brought some simplicity in one way, and it's abstracted the management and certainly the overhead of hardware failures and redundancy and all of that, it does also introduce its own degree of challenge. So I wouldn't say that moving to the cloud or SaaS type model gets rid of all of your risks. And then there's one other thing that I would also mention, and I go back to Claudette's point early on, is what happens with your data, right? So we have this concern about what happens when you feed your data to a large language model. Where's it going to get stored? Who gets to look at it? Is it going to end up in a training set? Is it going to get regurgitated to someone at some point in an answer a year down the road? There's a lot of these questions, but when we also share data that's relevant for our organization with third parties for other purposes, maybe that's storage with Google Drive, or maybe it's a Salesforce type thing to manage your clients, whatever it may be, there's implications to all of that. And as an organization, you can't outsource all the responsibility for the things that you collect. At the end of the day, you are accountable. So it can be very helpful to allow organizations to move quickly and to do so at a fairly low upstart cost. But there is still management overhead and challenge in these cloud environments too, in SaaS models.
Yeah. Well, Fred, I imagine this might be something that you come across in your work quite a lot with nonprofits. How would you say that folks can go about making sure that they are secure?
A lot of the questions we get in this space, nonprofits often have more than one product that they're using. So they may have a Google Workspace, they may have Teams going on, they've got Zoom going on, there's Slack working in the background. There's a lot happening, and there hasn't been, strategic decisions made about the technology stack within nonprofit. Mm-hmm. And I think when we talk about this, prioritizing where the dollars go and having dedicated resources internally that make these decisions about what are the tools that we're using to do our work effectively, and then making sure that those decisions are rooted in the problem rather than starting from the tool looking for a solution. Yeah. So remembering what the mission is, what are we trying to solve, and then decide which are the best tools to help us use that and be seamless about those choices.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you've brought up the point about not necessarily being tool-centric, but maybe being strategy and program-centric, especially for this particular sector. And I think that's a framing that we're seeing quite a lot as AI becomes more and more ubiquitous, right? There's a sort of AI-first approach of we need to embed AI, not how does AI serve our purpose and our mission. Does it even serve our purpose and our mission at this particular moment? We do have a question about tools, but I want to ask one more question about the sort of tech stack, as you've said, Wilfreda, and that's personal devices. Again, a lot of the sector probably is relying somewhat on personal devices, especially post-COVID, and especially those working on the front lines that might be using personal mobile phones. How do they go about making sure that they are not inadvertently compromising their own organizations if personal devices are a big part of how they do their work?
I'll take a first stab at that, if that's all right.
Of course.
So I think that number one, I mean, the obvious thing for mobile devices is to say keep it updated, right? Turn on automatic updates, make sure that stuff is patched. But I'll talk a little bit about cyber hygiene. And when we have this sort of environment where we mix personal with business, one of the common things that I see often intermixed is those passwords, where the passwords are very similar, if not the same, in the personal world as they are in the digital. One of the dangers of doing that is not only is there a potential effect to if you have a personal compromise leading to it affecting the organization that you're trying to support, but you also potentially have the flow going backwards, where a compromise in your organization could end up having an impact to your personal life. So I think where devices are being used that are personal, I know, for example, Google offers some pretty extensive segregation on phones that can be deployed, where you have like a work profile and you've got a personal profile, and those two things look very separate from each other. Apple's starting to work on a similar sort of model in their space as well. So there's a way to implement this securely. But I would say the big thing is if possible at all, to keep that separation away from those two entities, because it's mutual protection. And absolutely don't reuse those passwords. Avoid passwords altogether if you can. It'd be great to see people move more into a passwordless future. And then updates are incredibly important, especially in the mobile space that's becoming a more actively targeted environment. And the controls from a security perspective outside of what the operating system offers are not that ubiquitous compared to what we have on our desktops and on our laptops.
Yeah, absolutely. Claudette, I'm going to ask you the same question about personal devices. And Milos, just want to say also thank you for all of that very practical information that folks can take away. But Claudette, I wonder if you're seeing this in your work too, where there is this reliance on personal devices.
Yeah, I'll give you a telltale sign that you don't have good cybersecurity. Do you know what your cyber inventory is? So, and if it's some personal, some professional, then you have a problem.
Mm-hmm.
That means you don't have visibility to it all. That means you can never go to your board and say, we're in good shape when it comes to our cyber health and hygiene. So if you don't manage it, how can you measure it? How can you determine that it's a good thing? So I 100% agree with Milos on this one. You have to keep those two worlds separate as much as possible, or have a contained area where you're managing the work side. And if you go back in the day, like I do with BlackBerry, they had a device where you could have, it's the screen changed color. It was like light mode for personal and then dark mode for work. But you have to be able to separate those two things because it's very difficult to manage, and you will be insecure as a result. So certainly recommend that. And on your cloud point earlier, and this is actually a great point around policy as well. Policy could be, if you have a BYOD, then a part of it is managed by the organization. But in things like where it's convenient, many times when you find people struggling with why they can't do cyber the way they need to is because it's so inconvenient. I just invite people to think about what happens on the bad day and how much time you're going to spend, unpacking things and putting things back together as a result of us not making a few policy configuration and behavioral changes up front.
Yeah. And I actually want to touch on that, what happens on the bad day, because again, this all stems from the fact that many nonprofits and charities maybe don't have the capacity to maybe think what happens on that bad day where it does happen. And so someone's asked a really good question about affordable tools to enable data cataloging and data governance. Obviously knowing that cybersecurity is very, very tied to the way that we manage our data as well, and knowing that more often than not, I think a lot of nonprofits have maybe got a bit of a patchwork in place when it comes to how they manage their data. So any recommendations for tools, policies, practices for maybe pulling all that data into the right place such that, on that bad day, Claudette, as you say, there is a bit of a process that doesn't feel messy?
I know of many expensive tools, but I'll give you the advice someone gave to me. Excel is your friend. Spreadsheets are your friend. And so even just documenting it all and having it in a table format so you know what you have, where you have it, you don't necessarily need to make a massive investment. But I think the step before that is, do you have it? And so that the activity of consolidating everything and understanding and then tiering your hardware, your software, your applications. What is the most important thing? What's the thing you don't want to be out there in the public? That's where that digital crown jewels comes. What's that thing that you must protect? Maybe it's your information, maybe it's PII, maybe you have some secret sauce at your nonprofit that that's how you put the caramel in the bar. Whatever the thing is that you're doing, make sure that you've got maybe an up level of security around those things versus everything. Don't treat everything the same would be my advice.
Yeah. Okay, we are rapidly approaching the end of the hour. I just have one last question for Wilfreda, you in particular, but Milos and Claudette, please feel free to weigh in on this as well, because I think it's probably on everyone's minds about what financial support is available to the nonprofit and charitable sector, be that from philanthropic funding, be that from corporate funding. How can the sector access appropriate tools, and not tools necessarily, but pots of funding, be that through grants or operational support, to make sure that they are really in a good place on this? And are we in a place where that funding is available to folks at the moment?
Yeah, I know you're looking for a list here and specific names, but what I will say is I'll point back to Jennifer's comment at the beginning that have a conversation with your funder. Because as we move further into trust-based philanthropy with exceptional funders like RBC and others that we work with that care about the missions that our organizations are carrying out. And so having a conversation to say, these are our challenges, these are our priorities, how can we partner with you to address them in service of our mission, has proved very fruitful for us, and we support other organizations in doing that. So yes, I could tell you the CIRA grant. Yes, I could tell you do a search on Grant Connect, but this really is about building relationships in service of our great missions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We have one more question that has come in at the ninth hour, and it is if you suggest having time to do an internal type of certification to keep up with current IT knowledge, and reaching out again to some of those experts, finding your friend, as you like, to support that knowledge.
I'll take a quick stab at this one, maybe to kick it off. I wouldn't focus so much on certification, and I would encourage something that actually brings people together in a small organization. So you can definitely source external material for education. There's a lot that's already available publicly as well that's published. I know RBC, we publish a ton on how to keep organizations safe as well. But I would recommend having that conversation if it's a very small organization together, talk about it together, go through some of the knowledge together as a group, because it gives people the opportunity to ask questions. We don't all learn the same way. We don't all understand or take away the same knowledge from a piece of text. And when we have people going through a questionnaire or computer-based training in isolation, depending on the level of depth that it goes to, you may not achieve the goal that you're trying to achieve. And sometimes it's just good to get together and tell people some stories and help them understand what this actually means contextually, because people relate and remember stories better than they do questions that they read or bullet points that they read on a page somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, folks. Milos, Claudette, and Wilfreda, thank you so much for your time. This has been incredibly insightful, and I'm so glad that folks are able to take lots and lots of practical tools away. Perhaps I'll make an attempt at summarizing what we've talked about in the last hour. Firstly, this notion that the nonprofit and charitable sector runs on a lot of trust, and so cybersecurity is not unmarried from that trust. It's very deeply embedded and enmeshed with it. And so today is the day to start making some of that investment. I think we've done a fantastic job here of making cybersecurity very human, be that to Wilfreda's point of talking to your funders and talking to folks about why this is an important cost and budget line item and why it should be part of funding applications, all the way through to Milos and Claudette, actually the points that you made about having conversations within small organizations rather than leaving it necessarily to things like certification and some of those more formalized pieces, should you say. And Claudette, I think your point of having a cyber warden is a fantastic thing that organizations can take away today and really go and embed into their policies and processes. We've also hopefully left you with a lot of free resources on the good old internet that folks can go and access. So would love to hear from everybody that's on this webinar today about where you're at in your cybersecurity journey so far, and hopefully where you hope to get to as well. So once again, thank you so much to Milos, Claudette, and Wilfreda for joining us today and for lending us your expertise. And from RBC and Future of Good, thank you so much to the many of you that have stayed for the full hour of this webinar, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Take care.